They called me Doc, because that's what every platoon called their medic, but truthfully, I was never seen as much more than the guy who patched holes and kept hearts beating long enough for someone else to finish the fight. I'd been through training, carried the standard issue rifle like every other soldier, but whenever we hit the ground I was expected to crawl between bodies, shove gauze into wounds, jab morphine into shaking veins, and whisper words I didn't even believe in just to keep a man alive another 5 minutes. I accepted it, maybe even hid behind it, because being only the medic meant I wasn't expected to pull triggers, to carry the weight of taking lives the way the others did. My war was different, quieter, fought with bandages instead of bullets. At least, that's what I told myself before that night on the ridge, the night when 17 perfect rounds tore through the silence and carved my name into the battlefield. We had been holding a half-broken ridge for 3 days, a forgotten sliver of rock and dust that command insisted was strategically vital. To us, it was hell, a place where the earth smelled of spent gunpowder and the air tasted of metal. We were low on rations, lower on ammunition, and running on nerves so frayed that even the sound of the wind could make a man flinch. I kept myself busy, checking pulses, changing blood-soaked dressings, pretending not to notice the way our squad's numbers thinned with each sunset. There were 13 of us when we first took position. By the third night we were 9, and 2 of those 9 were barely standing. Fear clung to everyone's faces, even the sergeant's, though he barked his orders like a man who still believed we had a chance. When dusk settled, the sky bruised with smoke, we knew the enemy would come. They always did at night, probing our lines, testing the edges, trying to wear us down until we broke. That evening I sat with Corporal Mason, wrapping his leg where shrapnel had torn deep into the muscle. He gritted his teeth and told me he was fine, though the tremor in his voice betrayed him. "Doc," he whispered, "when they hit us tonight you stick low. We'll keep them off you." I nodded, but inside a small, bitter thought took root. Why did everyone always assume I was helpless, some fragile thing to be protected? I wanted to believe I could be more than the man with the medical kit, but the truth was I'd never been given the chance. That chance came sooner than I expected. The first shots cracked across the ridge just after midnight, bright flashes against the darkness, followed by the guttural thunder of machine guns. Tracers lit up the sky, red and green sparks streaking through the night like fireflies of death. I pressed Mason down behind cover and reached for my rifle out of reflex more than intention. The sound of boots crunching on gravel told me they were close, too close. My heart hammered in my chest, but instead of freezing, I felt something sharpen inside me, a blade of focus honed by every scream I'd heard, every man I couldn't save. The ridge erupted in chaos. Our squad returned fire, muzzle flashes strobing the rocks, but we were outnumbered, pressed from 3 sides. I crawled to where another man, Torres, was bleeding from a hole in his shoulder, the bone shattered. My hands worked automatically, packing gauze, tying a tourniquet, but my eyes kept flicking to the shadows moving up the slope, shapes too many for the dwindling rounds we had left. And then it happened, something inside me snapped. I wasn't going to let them overrun us, not while I still drew breath. I slung my kit to my side, raised my rifle, and sighted down the barrel at the first figure breaking into the open. One squeeze, one shot, the man dropped, rolling down the rocks. The recoil barely registered, my body moving as though it had always known how. Another figure appeared, rifle raised, and again I squeezed, the round cracking through his helmet. The battlefield blurred into a tunnel, my focus narrowing to the rhythm of breath, the steady press of my trigger finger. I was no longer just the medic scrambling between fallen bodies. I was part of the line, part of the fire keeping us alive. The others didn't even notice at first. They were too busy shouting, firing, surviving. But I noticed. Every shot I fired landed true, not wild, not desperate. It was as though all the quiet hours of watching others fight, of studying angles and listening to the rhythm of war, had been storing themselves inside me, waiting for release. I lost count after the 10th, but I remember the silence that followed, the way the ridge suddenly stilled as though the night itself had paused to catch its breath. I looked down at my rifle, smoke rising from the barrel, my hand steady as stone. 17 rounds. 17 bodies on the slope. The medic had vanished, and in his place stood a man the enemy would never underestimate again. The silence after the firefight was deafening, the kind that presses against your ears until you wonder if you've gone half deaf. Smoke clung to the rocks, curling in thin, ghostly threads, and the acrid stench of burnt powder lingered in my throat. My rifle was hot in my hands, the magazine empty, and for the first time since I'd set foot on that ridge, nobody was calling for me to patch them up. Instead, the surviving men were staring at me, some with disbelief, others with something close to awe. 17 rounds, 17 enemy soldiers cut down before they could breach our line, and every one of my brothers had seen it. I felt their eyes burn into me, questions they didn't dare ask, as if I had revealed a part of myself no one thought existed. Sergeant Keller was the first to break the silence. His voice was low, gravel roughened from too many cigarettes and too much shouting, but there was a note in it I had never heard before when he spoke my name. "Doc," he said, almost as if testing whether the words still fit. He crouched near the edge of the rocks, looking down at the dark slope littered with bodies that hadn't been there 10 minutes ago. That was something else. I didn't answer, not because I was being modest, but because I had no words for what I'd done. My hands still tingled, not with fear but with a strange calm, like every nerve had finally aligned to a purpose I hadn't known I carried. I slid a fresh magazine into the rifle and set it beside me, almost daring anyone to tell me I couldn't use it again. Mason, still clutching his leg, let out a low whistle. 17. I counted. His eyes were wide but not with fear, more like the way a man looks at a storm that somehow passed without tearing his house down. "Guess you're not just Doc anymore." The words sank into me deeper than I wanted to admit. For months, maybe years, I had lived behind that label, the one that said I was there to save but not to fight, to clean up after the battle but never change the course of it. And in one night, in less than a dozen heartbeats, that identity cracked wide open. Still, part of me resisted. I wasn't supposed to be this man with blood on his hands, wasn't supposed to feel the eerie steadiness that came with killing. I told myself I had done what was necessary, nothing more, nothing less, but deep down I knew it wasn't just necessity, it had been precision, control, even something close to mastery. Dawn came gray and slow, the sky bleeding pale light over the ridge. We took stock of what was left. 7 of us able to fight, 2 wounded but clinging on, and enough ammunition to last. Maybe another push if we were lucky. Keller gathered us around, his voice steadier than it had any right to be given our numbers. He talked about holding, about making the enemy bleed enough to keep them back, but I caught the flicker in his eyes when they slid to me. For the first time I felt like a piece on the board, not a bystander. "We hold this ridge because of him," Keller finally said, jerking his head toward me. 17 men down because our medic decided he's more than a medic. Don't forget that when they come again. The others nodded, some muttering words of agreement, others just watching me with the same unsettled respect. I wanted to shrink from it, to retreat back into the familiar shadow of bandages and morphine, but something inside me refused. The taste of last night was still in my mouth, bitter and sharp, but it carried a power I couldn't ignore. The day dragged on, long hours of heat baking the rocks and silence stretching between us. I moved between the wounded, checking Mason's leg, changing Torres's bandage, doing the work I'd always done. But every time I bent down with my kit, I felt the weight of the rifle slung across my back, and the men watching me not as a nursemaid but as someone who had carried them through the night. When dusk fell again, the tension wound tight as barbed wire. We all knew they would come back. The enemy didn't give up after one push, not when they knew we were cut off and bleeding out. As the shadows lengthened, Keller moved to my side, crouching low so the others couldn't hear. "Doc," he said, his tone rough, "I don't know what happened in you last night and I don't care. But when they hit us again, I want you up front with me. No more hiding behind the wounded. You proved yourself." His words should have been affirmation, but instead they hit like a stone in my gut. Up front. No more hiding. I had spent my whole life defined by what I wasn't, a fighter, a killer, a weapon. Now, in less than 24 hours, the definition had flipped, and I wasn't sure if I was ready to live inside that new skin. Still, I nodded because the truth was I couldn't deny what was boiling inside me. The night stretched its claws over the ridge, and we heard them again before we saw them. Boots on stone, whispers carried by the wind, the faint clatter of weapons. My heart should have been racing, but it wasn't. Instead, there was that same stillness, that same razor focus that had guided me the night before. When the first shots erupted, I didn't wait for orders. I raised my rifle, sighted down the scope, and let instinct take over. The medic was gone. The battlefield demanded something more, and I had no choice but to give it. The second night on the ridge came harder, sharper, like the enemy had learned from the first clash and returned with twice the fury. We heard them before we saw them, their voices low, their movements coordinated, no longer the reckless probing of a first attack but the cold, deliberate rhythm of soldiers determined to finish the job. The ridge shivered under the sound of mortar fire, the earth cracking open as dirt and shrapnel rained down on us. I pressed flat against the rocks, ears ringing, and when I lifted my head, I saw Keller already shouting orders, pointing me to the front line as if my role there was no longer in question. I moved without hesitation, rifle in hand, the weight of it steady and familiar now, no longer the foreign burden it had once felt like. The first wave hit fast, shadows spilling over the rocks with gunfire blazing. Our line roared back, every man firing until the barrels smoked, the night alive with sparks and thunder. I found myself at the edge, shoulder to shoulder with Keller, and when my sights locked on the first figure breaking from cover, the world narrowed again. I fired. The man crumpled and I shifted to the next without pause. 17 rounds the night before had felt like revelation, but now each shot came easier, smoother, as if my body had shed the hesitation it once carried. Around me the squad fought like cornered wolves, Mason leaning on his good leg to fire into the dark, Torres pale and sweating but refusing to stay down, the others grim and silent as they poured everything into holding that strip of ground. The enemy pressed harder, climbing over the bodies of their dead, shouting orders in a tongue that sounded like iron scraping stone. They thought we were breaking and maybe we should have been, but I felt a different energy ripple through the men. Where fear had ruled us before, something else now took its place. Something born of the memory of 17 perfect rounds and the belief that if the medic could hold, then so could they. I saw it in their faces, raw determination lit by muzzle flashes, their faith anchored not in command, not in strategy, but in the impossible fact that I had become more than the man with bandages. We fought for what felt like hours, time stretched thin by exhaustion and adrenaline, until my rifle clicked empty and my hands moved with practiced rhythm to reload. I couldn't stop, couldn't let myself think of what this transformation meant, not yet. All I knew was that if I slowed, if I faltered, the ridge would be lost, and with it every man beside me. The enemy broke eventually, not in a dramatic retreat but in the slow ebb of bodies falling back into the shadows, their fire dwindling until silence reclaimed the rocks. My chest heaved, sweat streaking dirt down my face, and when I finally lowered my rifle, I realized I was standing in a line of men who were still alive only because we had refused to give in. Keller clapped a hand on my shoulder, his grip firm, grounding. "Doc," he said, his voice hoarse but steady, "you're changing the way we fight. You know that." I wanted to deny it, to brush off the weight of his words, but I couldn't. Something inside me had shifted, and no amount of denial could put it back. I wasn't just saving lives anymore, I was taking them, and in doing so, I was shaping the battlefield itself. We counted again at dawn. 7 of us still alive, though Mason's leg was worse, Torres slipping in and out of fever, and the rest worn down to husks of men. But we were alive, and more than that, the ridge was still ours. The bodies of the enemy littered the slope in grim testament to our defiance, and for the first time, I saw a kind of respect in Keller's eyes that went beyond command. He didn't see me as a liability or a specialist anymore. He saw me as one of them, forged by fire and blood. The hours that followed were heavy, filled with silence and the low groans of the wounded. I moved between them, cleaning wounds, adjusting tourniquets, whispering the same promises I always had, but the rifle never left my side. The men noticed it, the way my hands could move from stitching a gash to locking a magazine without hesitation, and none of them questioned it. In their eyes, I wasn't just Doc anymore. I was something more dangerous, something necessary. As the day burned hot and dry, I found myself thinking about what it meant to change so suddenly, to step from one identity into another with no turning back. I remembered the first man I shot, the way he fell, the shock that had rippled through me. That shock was gone now, replaced by something colder, steadier. It scared me, though I never let it show. Could a man really walk both paths, healer and killer, savior and executioner? Or was I fooling myself, pretending I hadn't already crossed a line I could never return from? That question haunted me as the sun sank. And the shadows stretched again. We all knew the third night would come, that the enemy wouldn't let the ridge slip through their fingers. We were running out of food, out of water, out of strength, but none of us said it. What we had left was grit and the unspoken bond of men who had survived together against odds that should have buried us. When Keller passed me an extra magazine, his eyes steady, I understood his meaning without words. I wasn't the medic standing behind the line anymore. I was the line. The third night came like a storm we had all felt building, the kind of pressure that made the air heavy and the silence unbearable. We sat in the dark with our rifles resting across our knees, waiting, each man lost in his own thoughts, each breath shallow with the knowledge that this night could be our last. I checked Mason's bandages again, though I knew it was useless. The infection had set in deep, and the fever was crawling higher by the hour. Torres had passed into a haze of half-conscious mutterings, his skin gray, his body trembling, yet he still tried to lift his weapon whenever the others did, as if his mind refused to admit what his body already knew. Keller moved among us, not speaking much, but the weight of his presence kept us from splintering. He looked at me more than once, the kind of look that said he wasn't counting me as a medic anymore but as a pillar holding the ridge. That responsibility pressed heavy on my shoulders, but it was too late to set it down. When the first flare burst in the sky, washing the rocks in a harsh white glow, we knew the enemy was coming with everything they had left. The slope lit up with figures advancing in waves, rifles blazing, voices shouting over one another, a tide of bodies surging toward us. The sound was deafening, a thunder of boots and gunfire that shook the ridge. We opened fire as one, the line erupting with the kind of desperate fury that only men with nothing left to lose could summon. My rifle bucked in my hands, the recoil a rhythm that felt as natural as my own heartbeat, every round an answer to the chaos rushing up at us. I stopped counting kills after the first dozen, not because I didn't care but because numbers no longer mattered. All that mattered was keeping them back, holding the line long enough for dawn or for command to remember we existed. Beside me, Keller roared like a man possessed, his rifle spitting fire, his voice cutting through the storm with curses and orders alike. Mason fired from where he sat propped against the rocks, pale and shaking but gritting his teeth through the pain, every shot an act of sheer defiance. The enemy pressed harder, their bodies climbing over their fallen, grenades bursting among us with blinding light and shattering force. Shrapnel tore the air, stinging my skin, but I stayed upright, firing, reloading, firing again. At some point, a bullet grazed my arm, hot pain slicing through flesh, but I barely felt it. Adrenaline drowned everything except the need to fight, the need to hold. The ridge became a furnace of noise and fire, the world shrinking to muzzle flashes and the raw instinct to survive. Through it all, something strange settled in me, a kind of clarity, as if the chaos outside was nothing compared to the storm I had already lived inside my own head. I could see the field as if from above, each movement, each opening, each target lining up as if waiting for my hand. Every time I pulled the trigger, another enemy fell, and with each one the men around me fought harder, their belief in me feeding into their own survival. We became a wall, not unbreakable but unyielding, and for hours we gave the enemy nothing but blood and fire. When at last the tide broke and the survivors pulled back into the shadows, the ridge was unrecognizable. Smoke choked the air, the ground was carpeted with bodies, and our own number had shrunk again. Keller was bleeding from a deep cut across his chest, Mason had collapsed unconscious from blood loss, and Torres no longer breathed at all. 4 of us left who could still stand, though each one broken in some way, our strength nearly gone. I sat down hard against the rocks, the rifle still in my hands, my chest heaving. My arms ached, my body screamed, but inside I felt only a hollow quiet. I had fired until my magazines were nearly empty, until my shoulder burned from the recoil, and I had lost count of how many lives I'd ended. The others looked at me with the same mixture of respect and unease they had before, but stronger now, as if they no longer saw me as one of them at all but something beyond, something they couldn't name. Keller spoke between coughs, his voice ragged. "Doc, no. Not Doc anymore. You're the reason we're still breathing. If this ridge holds, it'll be because of you." His words should have lifted me, but instead they cut deep. I had wanted so badly to be seen as more than just a medic, and now that I wasn't sure I wanted the title I had earned. Healer and killer, savior and destroyer, 2 identities tearing at me from inside, and I didn't know which one would win. As the stars wheeled overhead and the night bled into morning, I sat with that rifle across my knees and the weight of 17 rounds behind me, then 30, then more than I could count. The men saw me as hope, as proof we could still fight. But inside, I wondered what would be left of me when this ridge was finally silent. By the 4th day on the ridge, the line between man and shadow had blurred. We were no longer soldiers in any recognizable sense. We were ghosts clinging to the rocks, bodies bruised and broken, eyes sunken, movements mechanical. Hunger gnawed at our stomachs, thirst cracked our lips, and the silence between attacks became almost unbearable, filled with the ticking of our own nerves. I kept moving among the survivors, tending Keller's wound, checking Mason's failing leg, watching over the others who were too exhausted to speak. My hands were still those of a medic, skilled and steady, but the rifle never left my side, and the men never looked at me without remembering what I had become. That night the enemy didn't come in waves. Instead, they tried to break us with fear, lobbing mortars from the distance, letting the shells fall at random intervals, forcing us to stay alert and awake, knowing sleep would mean death. The blast shook the ridge, carving new scars into the stone, and with each explosion, dust filled the air until it clogged our throats. Keller stayed upright only through sheer will, his chest wound bandaged but bleeding through, yet his eyes still burned with command. "They're softening us up," he rasped. "Next push will be the last. They'll throw everything." His words chilled us, not because we didn't already know, but because hearing them aloud made the truth final. I sat beside Mason as night deepened, his fever burning, his body trembling. He gripped my arm, his eyes glassy. "Doc," he whispered, still calling me that, though the word no longer fit. "Promise me you'll make it off this rock. If anyone can, it's you." I wanted to give him hope, to tell him we'd all walk off together, but the truth lodged in my throat like a stone. I simply nodded, pressing his hand until he let go, and I knew in that moment he was saying goodbye. When the attack came, it was unlike anything we had faced. They came from all sides, their numbers a flood, their firepower overwhelming. Tracers lit the night until it seemed the stars themselves were falling, and the ridge quaked beneath the sheer weight of the assault. We scrambled into position, the four of us still able to fight, and poured everything we had into the oncoming tide. Keller roared, his voice raw, firing with one hand pressed to his chest to keep the blood in. The others fought like men already dead, their faces twisted with the kind of defiance that doesn't care about survival. And me, I found that place again, that cold clarity where the world narrowed into targets and the rifle became an extension of my own body. Each shot was a decision, a judgment, and I made them without hesitation. Bodies fell in the flashes of light, one after another, until I lost track of how many I had sent to the ground. I moved like I had been born for it, no longer thinking of myself as a medic or even a soldier, just a force of will refusing to let the ridge fall. Grenades burst among us, throwing dirt and fire, and I felt shrapnel tear across my side, hot blood soaking my uniform. I staggered, but my grip on the rifle didn't falter. Keller went down beside me, his weapon clattering against the rocks, but even as he bled out, he managed a final growl, "Hold the line." His eyes locked on mine for one last instant, as if passing the weight of command onto my shoulders, and then he was still. Something inside me hardened at that moment. I rose higher than I should have, exposed to fire, and unleashed everything left in me. The world blurred into flashes and echoes, my body moving faster than thought, each squeeze of the trigger perfect, each round carving a hole in the tide. I screamed without realizing, my voice joining the thunder of battle, and for a heartbeat, it felt like I wasn't fighting alone but carrying the spirits of every man we had lost. When the smoke finally thinned, when the last echoes of gunfire faded, I was still standing, my rifle empty, my body shaking from blood loss and exhaustion. Around me lay the broken remains of both friend and foe, the ridge painted in the red truth of what we had endured. Only two of us were left breathing, myself and a private whose name I barely remembered, his eyes wide with shock, his body trembling like a child's. He looked at me as though I were something otherworldly, not a man at all but a weapon carved out of flesh and resolve. I collapsed to my knees, the rifle slipping from my hands, and for the first time since the first night, I allowed myself to feel the weight of what I had done. I was the reason we still held the ridge, but at what cost? My brothers were gone, Keller gone, Mason gone, Torres gone. The ridge was ours, but it felt less like a victory and more like a graveyard that had chosen me as its keeper. As dawn bled over the horizon, command finally answered our calls. Reinforcements arrived, their boots pounding across the stones, their eyes wide at the sight of the slaughter. They lifted me up, their voices full of questions I couldn't answer, their expressions torn between admiration and horror. One of them whispered, "This isn't a medic. This is something else." But I wasn't sure anymore. I had wanted so badly to be seen as more than the man with bandages. Now they would never forget me. The question was, would I ever forgive myself? When the reinforcements hauled me off the ridge, I was more ghost than man, my uniform soaked in blood, my body stiff with exhaustion. They dragged me past the lines of enemy corpses, past the broken remains of my own squad, and the world felt like it was tilting, as if reality itself had shifted on its axis. Voices buzzed around me, men marveling, muttering, shaking their heads at the sheer number of bodies I had left in my wake. 17 the first night, one said, dozens after. He's not just a medic. I wanted to shut their voices out, to bury my head in silence, but their words clung to me like burrs, impossible to shake. In the field hospital, the surgeons patched me up, stitching my side, cleaning the shrapnel wounds, binding me tighter than I thought possible. They asked me questions I didn't answer about how many I'd killed, about what happened on the ridge. Their pens scratched across paper, their eyes measuring me like I was some new kind of weapon they hadn't seen before. When I closed my eyes, I didn't see the doctors or the clean white lights above me. I saw Keller's eyes as he passed command with his last breath, Mason's fevered hand gripping mine, Torres muttering through pain until his voice went silent. I heard the gunfire, the screams, the echoes of 17 rounds that had started it all. Days passed in a blur. They fed me, forced me to rest, but they also kept me under observation, not as a patient but as something they didn't know what to do with. Word spread faster than I could have imagined. Men from other units came to see me, their faces filled with curiosity, some with admiration, others with unease. They asked about the ridge, about the kills, about how a medic had become the man who turned the tide. I never answered. What could I say? That I had been ordinary until the moment I wasn't? That 17 perfect rounds had unlocked something in me I couldn't explain? Instead, I sat silent, my hands restless, always twitching toward the rifle they wouldn't let me touch inside the ward. Command called me in after a week. The general himself sat behind a desk too polished for war, his uniform crisp, his eyes sharp as glass. He studied me like a specimen, flipping through reports while I stood at attention, still bandaged beneath my fatigues. You held the ridge, he said finally, his voice measured. Against impossible odds. Your actions prevented a full breach and saved the lives of men across the sector. His words should have filled me with pride, but they landed flat, hollow. Then he leaned forward, his gaze narrowing. You are wasted as only a medic. Men like you, men who can do what you did, don't come often. We want you reassigned. Special operations. Combat. The word struck me like a blow. All my life I had worn the label of healer, the one who mended what others broke. And now, because of one night, because of 17 rounds, they wanted to carve that label away and replace it with something colder, harder. I didn't answer immediately. My throat felt dry, my chest tight. He took my silence as thought and pressed on. You're already a legend among the men. Do you understand that? They look at you differently now. If you accept, you won't just be fighting, you'll be leading by example. You'll be what every soldier wishes he could be in the fire. Legend. The word twisted in me sharp and cruel. Legends were men who didn't sleep, who didn't dream of the faces of the ones they killed. Legends didn't sit awake in the dark wondering if they'd crossed a line they could never return from. But I saw in his eyes that there was no choice, not really. I had been remade on that ridge and there was no undoing it. When I left his office, reassignment papers in my hand, the men waiting outside looked at me with something like reverence. They called me Doc still, but the word no longer meant what it once had. It carried a new weight, a dual edge, healer and destroyer combined. That night, lying in a cot too clean, too quiet, I thought of the ridge again, of Keller's words, of Mason's promise. I wondered if they would recognize the man I was becoming, or if they would have recoiled from him. I wondered if I could ever forgive myself for surviving when they hadn't, when my survival had been written in blood across the rocks. Sleep came late, filled with flashes of fire and faces I couldn't forget. And in the silence before dawn, I realized the truth I had been avoiding. They had labeled me only a medic. But the battlefield had rewritten that label in blood, and no matter what I wished, I could never erase it. The reassignment came faster than I expected. One morning I was in the ward still bandaged and stiff, and by the evening I was in a truck rumbling down a dirt road with a unit I had never met, their eyes flicking toward me with the kind of curiosity usually reserved for myths. They knew the story, of course. Everyone did. 17 rounds on the first night, then more than any man cared to count afterward. They whispered it like scripture, as if the number itself had power, and though no one asked me directly, I could feel the weight of their expectations pressing in from all sides. They wanted me to be the thing the rumor said I was, not a man but a weapon disguised as one. We reached a forward outpost just before dusk, the air thick with the smell of oil and dust, the walls scarred from months of fighting. The commanding officer there greeted me with a nod, no questions, no pleasantries, just a glance at the papers that marked me as something different now. He pointed me toward the barracks, told me to get settled, and dismissed me like he didn't need to say more. In the barracks, the men shifted to make room, their eyes tracking me even when they tried not to. A younger soldier, barely more than a boy, finally spoke what they were all thinking. You're the medic, right? The one from the ridge. His voice trembled between awe and fear. I wanted to correct him, to tell him I wasn't just that anymore, but the truth was harder to say. Instead, I only nodded, and the silence stretched heavy until someone muttered, 17. That number hung in the air like smoke, suffocating, unshakable. Training with them was different than anything I had known. They pushed harder, expected more, drilled me in tactics I had only seen from a distance before. And every time I touched the rifle, their eyes lit with a strange mixture of hope and unease, as if waiting for me to unleash the same precision I had on the ridge. The first time we ran live fire together, I didn't miss. Every round hit, every target dropped in perfect rhythm, and when the exercise ended, no one clapped or cheered. They just stared, quiet, the air thick with the realization that the stories were real. At night, though, when the barracks fell silent and the stars pressed down on the canvas roof, I lay awake staring into the dark. The weight of Keller's final words still echoed in me. Hold the line. But what line was I holding now? Was it the line between life and death for the men beside me, or the line between the man I had been and the thing I was becoming? Each mission blurred that line further. We moved into enemy territory, surgical strikes meant to cripple their strength, and each time I was pushed to the front, my rifle the tip of the spear. I fired, and men fell, always true, always clean, as if fate itself guided my aim. The others began to depend on it, to count on me not just for survival but for victory, their belief in me turning into something close to worship. They didn't say it aloud, but I saw it in their eyes. They no longer thought of me as human in the same way they thought of themselves. They thought of me as inevitable, as death made flesh. The worst part was that I couldn't even deny it. The clarity came every time, the stillness inside me that turned the chaos of battle into something almost simple, almost pure. I hated it, feared it, yet I couldn't resist it. Afterward, when the smoke cleared and the bodies cooled, I went back to patching wounds, to pressing bandages against torn flesh, to whispering reassurances into trembling ears. The men looked at me differently in those moments too. They saw the hands of a healer wrapped around the same fingers that had pulled the trigger. They didn't understand how both could exist in the same body, and neither did I. One night, after a raid that left more than 50 enemy soldiers sprawled in the dirt, I sat alone at the edge of camp, staring at my blood-streaked hands. The young soldier who had spoken to me that first night approached, hesitant, his face pale in the moonlight. He sat beside me without asking and finally said, "How do you do it? How do you keep steady when everyone else shakes?" His voice cracked with the weight of the question. I thought about lying, about telling him it was training or luck or something easy to swallow. But the truth clawed at my throat until I let it out. "I don't know," I said, my voice hollow. "Maybe I was never meant to be just a medic. Maybe this was always inside me waiting." He looked at me like he didn't know whether to be inspired or terrified, and maybe that was the right way to see me now. When he left, I sat in the dark until the sun began to rise, and I realized that the number 17 had been only the beginning. It wasn't a legend anymore. It was a curse, one that bound me tighter with every round I fired, every life I took, every man who looked at me as if I were more myth than flesh. And deep down, I feared the day when I would no longer remember which side of the line I was meant to stand on. The next dawn was pale and thin, like the sky itself was trying to forget what had happened the day before. Smoke still curled from the far ridges where the enemy had fled, and the air reeked of scorched metal and dried blood. My uniform was stiff with it. My rifle, the same one I had picked up in desperation, lay across my knees as I sat at the edge of what used to be a defensive wall. The silence was different now. Not tense, not heavy. Just hollow. As if the world had stopped breathing. I could still hear the echoes of that night, the whistle of bullets, the crack of my own fire, the way every squeeze of the trigger had felt like another heartbeat. I counted them again in my head. 17. Not 18. Not 16. 17 rounds. All placed like I had trained for it all my life, except I hadn't. I'd been trained to bandage wounds, to call for medevac, to stop bleeding. I was never meant to stop hearts. And yet, that's what I had done. Every shot had saved someone. And yet, every shot had taken someone too. Captain Rhodes came up behind me, limping slightly on his injured leg, though he wouldn't admit it. "We cleared the perimeter," he said, his voice rough from smoke and shouting. "You did good, document." I didn't answer right away. My eyes were still on the valley below, where the sun was rising behind the blackened treeline. "Don't call me that," I muttered. "Not today." He didn't argue. He just stood there beside me for a long time, watching the sun climb, letting me be quiet. Rhodes wasn't the kind of man who needed to fill silence. He'd seen too many kids lose themselves after battles like this. Some never came back even if their bodies did. "You know," he said finally, "if it weren't for you, that ridge would have fallen. And if it had, we'd all be gone. You didn't just patch people up. You saved this entire company." I turned to look at him. There was no praise in his eyes, just understanding. And that meant more than any medal ever could. Because he knew. He pulled the trigger too once. Maybe more times than I ever would. We buried the dead that afternoon. Our own, not theirs. There were too many enemy bodies to count, and too few shovels to give them all graves. We covered them with tarp and stones. We didn't always give time for dignity. I helped carry the stretchers, helped wrap the ones I'd treated but couldn't save. It was different when you'd looked into their eyes as they bled out. You remembered the way they tried to speak. The way their hands clutched at yours. I carried that too. Not just their weight, their final moments. One of the younger soldiers, Peterson, barely 19, kept following me around that day. I'd pulled him behind cover when the first wave hit. He'd been in shock for most of the fight. "How'd you do it?" he asked quietly while we lowered another body into the ground. "How'd you stay calm enough to shoot like that?" I looked at him, this kid who still had dirt smudged on his cheek like war paint. "I didn't stay calm," I said. "I just knew what had to be done. And I did it. That's all." He nodded slowly, but I could see the way his hands trembled. He wasn't just asking about me. He was asking about himself, wondering if he'd ever be able to do the same. I didn't have the heart to tell him that once you did, you were never quite the same again. That night, the higher-ups came. Brass and clean uniforms and polished boots, untouched by mud or blood. They wanted reports, commendations, numbers. They asked me to walk them through the sequence, how I'd transitioned from medic to marksman, how I'd maintained accuracy under pressure. They called it remarkable. I called it survival. One of them, a colonel with cold eyes, even suggested they might recommend me for sniper training. I refused. Not because I couldn't, but because I wouldn't. I wasn't a killer. I was a healer who had been forced, for one brutal night, to become something else. They wrote things down anyway. But when they asked if I'd do it again, if I'd fire those same 17 rounds if I had to, I didn't hesitate. Yes, I said. If it meant saving them. Every time. Weeks passed. The front shifted. We moved on to another sector. The ridge became just another name on the map, another memory buried under new orders. But for me it never faded. The faces stayed. The weight of the rifle. The silence after the last shot. I kept my kit stocked with gauze and morphine, but I never forgot how to aim. I never forgot what I was capable of when everything else failed. The men didn't forget either. They stopped calling me document, they started calling me shield. Not because I was the best shot, but because when it all fell apart, I stood between them and the end. That meant something in a place where death walked beside you every day. One night, months later, we were camped out after another long patrol. Rhodes passed me a flask and sat down beside the fire. He didn't say much. Just handed me a folded piece of paper. A letter. From command. Commendation for bravery. A medal, postmarked and sealed. "You earned it," he said simply. I didn't open it. I didn't need to. The medal wouldn't change what I had done or what it had cost. But I kept the letter anyway. Because maybe someday when I was far from the battlefield, I'd be able to read it without feeling the recoil in my bones. I never wanted to be anything more than a medic. I wanted to save lives, not take them. But war doesn't care what you want. It only cares what you do when everything falls apart. And when it did, I stood up. I fought. I saved them. Not because I was trained to. Not because I wanted glory. But because someone had to. And when the last round was fired, when the smoke cleared and the silence returned, they saw me differently. I wasn't just a medic anymore. I was the one who didn't break. The one who turned 17 perfect shots into a shield. And though I still carried the weight of every life I took, I also carried the lives I saved. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough. The end.